More options? This is the new meta for resin efficient artifact farming starting in 2.0. We're getting spoiled, my YouTube frogs. This upcoming domain, hopefully it's a domain based off of the closed captions here, will be the most resin efficient dungeon to farm for general progression. This used to be Noblesse dungeon, but now that both of these sets in their two-piece form can be used on nearly all characters, this overtakes the drawback of Bloodstain, which is the dungeon pairing with Noblesse, which only benefits physical. Welcome back, Xlice frogs, to another YouTube video. With Inazuma coming in just a couple of days from this recording, I like to break down the quote-unquote worth of these upcoming artifacts. First, I'll discuss the mixture of their two-piece sets and why this theoretically will become the highest resin efficiency for progression. Then I'll discuss viability of Severed Fate on applicable characters, and finally discuss viability of Reminiscence on applicable characters as well. Let's begin. You can see on the screen here, Emblem of Severed Fate grants 20% recharge on the two-piece set, and four-piece set grants Q damage increase by 25% of the character's recharge. So, every character has a base recharge of 100% before debuffs and buffs, which is 25% Q damage increase, and to achieve 75%, you would need 300% recharge. Now for the second one, Shimenawa's Reminiscence grants 18% attack on the two-piece set, and four-piece set requires 15 energy to activate, which grants 50% normal charge plunging damage after an E and sacrificing that 15 energy. You can view the two-piece as a farmable gladiator set, and the four-piece to be a strong but sacrificing buff on certain viable characters. So, I want to talk about the mixture of these two-piece sets, which is the easiest starting point for most character builds, not requiring the pain of getting four-piece decent sets for a full set, right? So we have Severed Fate's 20% recharge, which is the first 5-star artifact set which grants this stat. In the early stages of the game, we only have 4-star sets, Scholar and Exile, to provide this stat. So having this introduced is a great quality increase to late game playstyle where recharge is an extremely valuable stat to maintain Q uptime. Then we have Reminiscence's 18% attack, which is a farmable version of the not so easy to farm gladiator set, available from overworld bosses that cost 40 resin per single try. This is also a great quality increase to general sub DPS, main DPS, offensive support, or any attack scaling character's build path. With these sets being introduced as a pair beginning in 2.0, you can see how resin efficient it would be to live in the dungeon for nearly every character that benefits from either recharge and or general attack for the two-piece sets. Now, of course, this two-piece set is not the best in slot for certain characters. It is astronomically easier to farm though, and a great stepping stone to get you to that end game point where focus farming for a single character becomes your goal. So this truly becomes the first pairing of artifacts that quote-unquote has a universal two-piece set bonus, which makes resin usage here have the highest chance of improving your roster the fastest. Now, before we get into discussion on both of these sets uniquely for certain characters, I want to provide characters who don't actually benefit from the two-piece mixtures that we just said, right? So the two-piece mixture here is energy recharge plus 20% and attack percent plus 18%. So a lot of characters do benefit, right? So I'm going to give you guys a list of characters who don't benefit, and there's only a couple. Noelle, Albedo, and Barbara. So with those characters I just mentioned, even the 20% recharge is still moderately beneficial to all three. The Anemo characters that we have that are Kazuha, Jean, Venti, and Sucrose, and Anemo MC, they'll still prefer the 4 iridescent set, but that's just because the resistance thread is unique and a very powerful 4-piece set. All those Anemo characters that I just mentioned can still use this two-piece mixture. With those 3 that don't quite use it, and the other 4 or 5 who are the Anemo characters, right? That leaves the remaining 25 or so characters who all somewhat benefit from either the 20% recharge and or the 18% attack, which is a lot of characters, right? So that is why I would view this as the quote-unquote new meta resin efficient artifact dungeon to farm. So hopefully with that explanation, you guys can see how universal this mixture is, which makes artifact farming much less annoying, right? Because that means that resin can always be defaulted to this domain to farm for these 2 artifacts. All right, so let's have a more focused discussion this time on just the Severed Fate set. I'm going to attempt to order these in terms of excellent usage and then go down from there. So this set is typically best in slot for those characters whose damage come mostly from their Q, right? Usually when this is the case, their Q costs at the higher end between 60 to 80 energy. These characters typically aim to hit like 200% or higher recharge to maintain that Q uptime as best as possible without sacrificing offensive capability, right? On top of the Q uptime, these characters may also have a longer cooldown E, efficiency, which makes them less quick swappable and even more reliant on the Q. The best in-slot characters are, with this new Severed Fate set, Xiangling as offensive support, Xingqiu, the water boy that we know and love for Vaporize and Freeze comps, Beidou as an offensive electro support, Mona for just general support uses, and uniquely, Xingyan's for Q spam support, right? So this is a little bit different. I'll touch on this maybe a little bit later, but Noblesse and Physical are really close. So though a 4-piece set here would be best in slot, not by too much. And then we move on to characters for general usage, right? So we have Bennett can generally use it, Zhongli for the Q support, Venti if you're not running Viridescent, Rosaria offensive crowd support, Changyun offensive crowd support, Lisiv offensive electro support, and then Kea offensive crowd support. And then finally, these are the characters that I do not recommend you use the 4-piece at all. Razor, right? Just like Noblesse doesn't work on Razor, 4 Severed Fate would also not work. And Shout. Both of these characters use their Q to buff their existing normal plunge damage, right? Or convert. And Noblesse would not work on these characters, so Severed Fate also 4-piece doesn't work. I may have missed some, but generally this set is pretty viable on a lot of characters, right? All right, let's discuss each of these characters in brief detail because their situations are mostly similar, so I'm going to condense all the information. First, on the best in slot character lineup, we have Xiangling, which is offensive power support. This set will be the new best in slot for her. Most of her damage comes for insane total multiplier on her Q, and it costs 80 energy, which makes her recharge a very valuable stat, right? All the other alternatives that would still be viable: 2 Crimson, 2 Noblesse, 4 Noblesse as well, that's fine. General, 2 Gladiator, 2 Noblesse, these are all viable options, but the new best in slot will be the 4 Severed Fate. So this is not hybrid main DPS Xiangling, this is offensive pyro support Xiangling, which is mostly focused on her Q. So next is Xingqiu, right? This is the new best in slot for him. This is stronger than 2 Heart of Depth, 2 Noblesse. Most of his damage comes from his Q, the water swords. And his E cooldown is longer than his Q by 1 second, right? So if Sacrificial Sword doesn't reset his E, he really values higher recharge for consistency. Other alternatives that are still viable, you can still mix and match Gladiator, Wanderer, Noblesse, right? Those are all fine. If you're running the national team, then this will be efficient for both Xiangling and Xingqiu, right? So if you're doing 4 Severed Fate. Quickly over to Beidou. So this is for offensive electro support Beidou. This is the new best in slot for her, as most of her damage comes from her Q in support situations. She's great for assisting taser comps that revolve around electro charged reactions and her Q to be up, right? Since she's focused as a support here, her reactive E counter is less important, right, for this particular build. So other alternatives, you can still use Thundering Fury, Gladiator, Noblesse, like mix and match 2-2 sets. And typically when you're using an electro charged Beidou support, she's most likely either run with Mona, Xingqiu, right, for electrocharge compositions. The resin for them is also efficient because they're also in the same category. All right, moving on from Beidou, let's go over to Mona. This is also the new best in slot for her, as not only is the core of her kit her Q and its buff, but also her Ascension stat grants her more energy recharge scaling, right? So her Q damage gets even more of a buff with this set. So the other alternatives are still fine, 2 Heart of Depth, 2 Noblesse, Wanderer, Gladiator, etc. But because of her unique ER Ascension scaling, this set is a little bit more prioritized on her, all right? So that covers the best in slot for those 5 characters, right? In all of those cases, you guys can see that resin is definitely worth using to refarm their gear in 2.0. As most likely, you'll be able to mix and match a bunch of 2-piece sets in a lot of places, right? Along with that, it basically becomes like a universal 4-piece set for a lot of offensive supports. Lastly, we get to Xingyan, and I want to touch about this, right? Because it's not that resin efficient for her, because 2-piece physical, which is Pale Flame or Bloodstain plus Noblesse, or 2-piece physical twice, which is Pale Flame plus Noblesse, right, is pretty close to typical gains from Severed Fate. So in this case, it's harder to justify resin efficiency since her boost in stats is much lower than what the previous characters that we just mentioned would gain, right? It's still an improvement, but the amount of resin to equalize may not be worth for this specific build. So that wraps up the best in slot characters, where we took a brief look at all the characters who share all the same situations, with the Severed Fate 4-piece being their best option. Now let's talk general usage characters, where Severed Fate is now an additional option to choose from. We have a bunch, right? Bennett's a mixed case, so if he's purely support to buff your teammates and heal, Noblesse is still the preferred choice to maximize on his buffing. Also, with this set coming out, some characters will slowly phase out of Noblesse gear, which means a loss of that 4-piece Noblesse buff, right? So I'd still keep him on Noblesse in this case. Otherwise, you can run Severed Fate, 4-piece. It's basically the same as Noblesse, just no attack boost for the team, and his Q does more damage on the slam, right? His Q damage, I mean, it's not a small amount, right? Especially with Melt or Vaporize. So it is an option, but I would still prefer Noblesse. Zhongli. Now, Zhongli, this is just for Q support Zhongli, right? With the Severed Fate set being introduced, Zhongli now has 4 possible artifact sets for a tanky support Q focus build. So we have upcoming Severed Fate, we have Tenacity set, we have Petra set, and we have Noblesse set, right? In my opinion, you basically can't go wrong with mixing any of the above in a 2-piece setting. So what I'm talking about is like 2-piece Severed Fate, 2-piece Tenacity, 2 Tenacity, 2 Noblesse, Petra, 2 Noblesse, Petra, 2 Severed Fate, right? Like the 2-piece mix and match for all of those 4 is viable on him. For specific 4-piece sets, I'd prioritize 4 Tenacity over 4 Noblesse over 4 Severed Fate. So if you were to choose a 4 set to use, Tenacity I would still view as number 1 in my opinion. I would view Zhongli as a support shielder, so priority is given to Tenacity for shield strength and over Noblesse for attack buff, over Severed Fate for district Q damage, right? Now let's move on to a Venti, right? So this specific case that I'm talking about for Venti is for those who want to avoid the viridescent domain and or rely less on the resistance threat of that set, right? So in that case, either 2-piece mixed or 4-piece Severed Fate both work to increase his raw damage multipliers. Friendly reminder though, I want you guys to make sure you're understanding that his Q does do damage, and it does a lot of damage, right? DOT takes for quite a bit over the entire duration, but I want to remind you guys that this does not improve his swirl damage, right? So swirl damage is different than his raw multiplier damage, right? So just so you guys understand, this does not improve his swirl damage. The 4 Severed Fate does not, okay? So this set is usable for him as a stepping stone to eventually farming 4 Viridescent, as with normal anemo characters. All right, so that's Venti. Moving on to Rosaria. So Rosaria as an offensive crowd support, not a physical main DPSer, right? So this is a great 4 set on Rosaria, very similar output to a standard 2 crowd, 2 Noblesse, or 4 Noblesse build. Because Rosaria suffers less from recharge issues with her low cooldown E and 60 cost Q, which you can see here, right? So her E is on a 6-second cooldown, and her Q is on a 15-second cooldown with 60 energy cost, right? I would say most of the artifact options are relatively similar for her. So I would say between Noblesse, Cryo, Severed Fate, I would prioritize the substats. I would still view Severed Fate as the strongest, right? Because you do want a decent amount of recharge on her, right? But mix and match is still great on her. So if you were to choose, right, like the number 1 set, I would still view Severed Fate as number 1 set. So now, for Chongyun, resin efficiency is lower than most for Severed Fate set because his Q only costs 40 energy, right? Which means less investment on recharge and more on raw damage or EM for reverse melt comps. So for Severed Fate, even on a 150 recharge Chongyun build, still grants 37.5% bonus Q damage, which is slightly higher than 2 crowd, 2 Noblesse. So it's definitely still an option, right? This set is, in my opinion, still better long-term than our alternatives, but it's not an immediate priority in comparison to the other characters. So it is his strongest set, but prioritize other characters first. So Lisa's a little bit more situational than other characters because her main source of damage is typically her hold E. Not only that, but this is only maximized when you have Lisa's C6, right? Because then every single time you swap in, every 5 seconds, you immediately tap 3 stacks on enemies, which means your hold E does the maximum amount of damage, right? So in general cases, I would say that 2 Thundering, 2 Noblesse is fine. Severed Fate 4 set would be a strong go-to if she's used for your electric charge comps. It's totally viable. Kea as an offensive crowd support. Kea is a great choice for Severed 4 set, especially at C2. Now, his C2 does increase his duration of his Q up to a maximum of 15 seconds, which is the cooldown of his Q, right? If he's used as a Q swap for your team, this becomes a very strong option. If you're running him support on a freeze comp, which is very common, I would still value 4 Blizzard due to the massive crit rate boost, which stabilizes damage, right? So overall for Kea, I think that the 3 sets that I've been mentioned are all very viable. It just depends on the subsets, right? So you have 4 Blizzard for freeze comp, we have Severed Fate for just general Q damage, and then Noblesse for just general support buff, okay? All right, so I believe that covers most of the potential 4-piece set usage scenarios. So you guys can see the 4-piece on the Reminiscence set is a little bit more restrictive, right? We can't just go around and slap this on just anyone who wants normal charge punching attack bonus damage because there's a 15 energy minimum and it's lost on activation. Sorry, Xiaomains, it be like that sometimes. So now we've already touched upon the 2-piece set right here, being a farmable gladiator, and that is really where the set shines in terms of its universal usage. But there are some characters who do benefit from the the 4-piece of this set, and those characters can sacrifice their Q energy because it's less important for a particular playstyle, right? They are sub DPS or main DPS Kazuha, where you sacrifice his Q. All right, this is not for buffing Kazuha, all right? Melt Ganyu, a focus on her charge shot, ignore Q. Tartag, where his ranged Q refunds 20 energy, so you can lead with the ranged Q and then E to swap in. Then Huta, situational but can work, and then Yenfei. So this Yenfei is a focus on charge attack damage. Q is just another charge buff. Okay, so characters that I would not recommend, though it may seem like an option. Please, despite her Q not persisting on swap out, it's still a large amount of damage when she's able to proc it, right? And also because she holds 2 E charges, 4-piece can be very punishing if you do double E. Official. The physical sets are just better, right? 50% normal charge plunge damage and 18% is great. But a Pale Flame Bloodstain gives you 50% physical, which is basically most of her damage anyway, right? Because her normal attacks are doing physical damage, right? And then unfortunately Xiao, right? So there's no easy way to have 4-piece passive up and have his Q up at the same time, right? If you use the E, then you can't be able to Q after because you lost energy. And if you Q first, you have no energy to proc the E 4-piece, right? And you can't switch out because then your Q runs out. So unfortunately for Xiao, 4-piece Reminiscent is a no-go. Lastly, Diluc. He's designed for the 4 Crimson set, right? That domain is painful. So 2 Crimson, 2 Reminiscent is a stepping stone build. I would not do 4-piece Reminiscent. All right, so let's go over briefly on the characters that I've mentioned for 4-piece Reminiscence. Let's begin with sub DPS, main DPS Kazuha, okay? If you're running Kazuha as a sub DPS, main DPS, and not focus on his buffing capability, then sacrificing his Q uptime, right, to maintain high plunge and normal charge damage is an option. It's not optimal, but it's an option. I would view this as a stepping stone build if you have the resin to commit to a solid 4 Viridescent set for him, right? You can start with 4-piece Severed Fate, but eventually you really want to try to snatch that 4 Viridescent shred, okay? So for the topic of sub DPS, main DPS Kazuha, right? It's a possible build. I'm not saying it's an optimal build, right? It can be used. I would still definitely recommend 4 Viridescent, but I know how tough that domain can be. And with 2.0 coming right away, if you don't have a good 4th set, it might be okay to just dive into the new sets, okay? Melt Ganyu. So this is basically a stronger version of 4 Wanderers, but it's much easier to farm. So since Melt Ganyu, right? Melt Ganyu tends to ignore her Q because it's persistent and it ruins Melt reaction. So this is mathematically the best in slot for Melt Ganyu, where you only focus on the E and the charge attack, right? So, for comparing stats, 80 Elemental Mastery is generally comparable to 80% attack, right? At 0 Elemental Mastery, giving plus 80 EM is a 15% Melt Vaporize increase, and it's diminishing as the higher EM you go, okay? So the 2-piece are relatively comparable. Now, for the 4-piece for Reminiscent, 15% higher than the Wanderer's 4-piece, right? Which calculates to about an 8 to 12% damage increase. So, for current or aspiring Ganyu mains who might want to try out Melt Ganyu but don't have Wanderer's 4-piece, this is the artifact for you to farm. All right, moving on to Tartag. So Tartag is all unique, and I feel like some people might not know, but Tartag's ranged Q refunds 20 energy. You can see right here, energy return on range is 20 energy, right? So if you want to lead with like a vaporized start, you typically might be doing like an EQ start, right? But you can do a Q first and then you can E right afterwards, right? So it's a little bit of micro, but it's still doable. So this is definitely an achievable 4 set for Tartag to use if the Hydro artifacts for you have not been kind. Though this set is mathematically stronger though, the 4-piece Hydro set is a little bit more forgiving on the playstyle, right? So you don't have to really think about maintaining your energy to do this, right? So it's good, but it's restrictive, so just keep that in mind. All right, moving on to Hutan. So for those Hutan mains out there who tend to ignore her Q a lot, right, then this set becomes slightly stronger than the 4 Crimson. It's about 10% stronger. Honestly, depends on your playstyle though, right, and requires another 4-piece set to farm to compete with the 4 Crimson. It's definitely usable and it's definitely strong on her, but it's still restrictive, right? All right, last but not least, Yenfei. Yenfei is one of those characters that actually benefits pretty highly from this set in my opinion, right? She's a character that's focused on your charge attack damage, and the Q is just another charge attack buff, right? So the Q does do an initial damage. The main purpose of it is granting you Scarlet Seals and for your charge attack bonus, right? I would say this is a great set for Yenfei. She doesn't actually need to rely too much on her Q. Whenever it's up, it's fine to use, right? But you don't ever really think about like, oh wait, when is my Yenfei's Q up? Most of her damage comes from her 9-second rotation where you E auto. and then apply a bunch of charge attacks, right? This makes the Reminiscence set decently strong on Yanfei. It's stronger than the 4-piece Wander and 4-piece Crimson, just with a caveat of a different playstyle, right? You're losing 15 energy for this. So if I were to refarm for my Yanfei's gear, I might try this out. Who knows? But it seems like pretty viable. Okay. All right. So I think that wraps up most of my thoughts on these new artifacts. If you guys did enjoy the video, I'd really appreciate you liking and subscribing to the channel. It's free to support. It really helps me, and we're so close to 100,000 subs. So I really appreciate it. I wish you all the best of luck on your artifact farming endeavors, and I look forward to creating a bunch of content for Inazuma. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll catch you gamers on the next one. Take care.